September 18th, Universal Century 0079. The day Zeon feared had finally arrived. They knew the Federation would try to develop their own mobile suits, but they hadn't expected them to be this powerful. Overnight, the RX-78-2 rendered not just Zeon's current mobile suits obsolete, but even the ones they were still developing, including the one that was meant to become their next generation flagship mobile suit. The Gundam was a monster, so they needed their own monster to counter it. As I described in my GAN development history video, officially there was a competition happening for which mobile suit would fill this role. There was a space version of the DOM, the Rig DOM, a development of the Zaku High Mobility Type R1A, the Zaku High Mobility Type R2, a close combat specialist design, designed to work together with the Rig DOM, the GAN, and then finally a new general purpose mobile suit, the Gelgoog. Unofficially though, this competition was just window dressing. The Rig DOM and the R2 were deemed unsatisfactory due to their inability to use beam weapons, and they would then have their own individual competition to determine which one of these would become Zeon's stopgap unit, until the real monster could be produced. This competition would be won by the Rig DOM. The GAN then was just kinda there, almost to make the Gelgoog look good by comparison. From early on in development, the Zeon High Command had set their sights on the Gelgoog, and this became very evident by the end of the project when all three of Zeon's main weapons manufacturers were involved. Usually, Zeon's mobile suits and even their mobile armors were made by a single company. For example, Zeonic is famous for the Zaku, Zimat is famous for the DOM, and MIP is famous for the Big Row. But the Gelgoog became a joint project by these three companies, with each of them being assigned the role that they specialized in. Clearly a sign that Zeon wanted this machine to be the best that it could possibly be. Zeonic would be responsible for the basic design of the Gelgoog, Zimat would take care of the propulsion and, according to some sources, also the reactor, and MIP was charged with developing the beam weapons. Now, less than a minute ago, I said that the Zaku High Mobility Type R2 wasn't adopted because it couldn't handle beam weaponry. And then after that, it also lost the competition with the Rig DOM to become Zeon's stopgap mobile suit. But that didn't mean that it was down for the count just yet. In their pursuit of making a beam-capable mobile suit, Zeonic decided to bet on multiple horses. At Solomon, they began work on a seemingly brand new prototype, the MS-06R2S. The idea here was to equip it with 2 megaparticle cannons on the abdomen directly linked to the mobile suit's reactor, similar to what we see with Zeon's amphibious mobile suits. Unfortunately for this prototype, the reactor wasn't powerful enough, and the project began falling way behind Zeonic's other prototype, the MS-06R3. Of the 4 MS-06R2s that were made, 3 units were assigned to legendary ace pilots Johnny Ryden, Gabby Hazard, and Robert Gilliam. But the 4th unit was kept at Granada for further development. And it was this unit that would be further modified into the MS-06R3, also nicknamed the Zaku 3. The plan here was to give it a beam rifle using the ECAP system that was also seen in the Federation's RX-78-2 Gundam, and to expedite its development, it used a lot of prototype parts that were meant for the Gelgoog's development. As a result, the unit also became known as the Gelgoog prototype. But so, development of the actual mobile suit went pretty well, and it was rolled out in October. And here I'm gonna speculate that this was early October because the pre-production actual Gelgoogs were rolled out in late October. And it was said that the data gathered by the R3 Gelgoog prototype would play an important role in finalizing the design of the Gelgoog actual. There was just one problem for the R3. The all-important beam rifle wasn't done. Initially, it was being developed by just the Albert Company, but they hit a roadblock. They just couldn't downsize the beam rifle to the desired size. And with the RX-78-2 breathing down their neck, the Zeon High Command ordered MIP to assist with this beam rifle. As mentioned before, MIP was famous for their mobile armors, and they were also experts at beam technology. With them on board, it wouldn't take long for the beam rifle to be completed, and the model number of this Zaku Gelgoog hybrid was changed to MS-06R3S. Its other weapons then were a pair of head-mounted Vulcan guns and a heat saber. While it did have a new generator capable of handling beam weapons, handling multiples at once did still prove to be difficult, so just to be sure, they went with a tried and true heat saber. According to surviving records then, once it was fully completed, the R3S was assigned to the Musai class Hockham for testing, with the test pilot being Sergeant Thomas Meyer. During a routine test though, they would accidentally run into Federation forces, resulting in a battle where Sergeant Meyer managed to shoot down 2 GIMs. Not only was this a fantastic test for the R3S, but it also immediately proved that the mobile suit, along with its new beam rifle, were battle-worthy. What's interesting about this battle though is that we don't know exactly when it takes place, and it might have even happened at the time that the YMS-14 pre-production Gelgoog was being rolled out, or potentially even after they were already all rolled out. Because here's an interesting fact: despite the troubles with the beam rifle, development of the Gelgoog itself was still steadily advancing, and the decision was made to simply go ahead with it. In late October, 25 YMS-14 pre-production Gelgoogs were rolled out, and as you might be expecting, because the beam rifle was not completed at this time, these YMS-14s initially lacked important features to use those beam weapons. And so, it wouldn't be until later that they were upgraded to become fully beam weapon capable. Unfortunately, we don't know exactly what these upgrades would be or when they were carried out, and so as a consequence, we also don't know the difference between the rollout version and the version of the YMS-14 that would eventually become the finalized MS-14S Gelgoog commander type. But back to the rollout. One of the 25 machines would be assigned to Char, and the other 24 were assigned to the newly formed Elite Chimera Corps. One of their main missions concerning the Gelgoog was testing out the machine so that they could come up with future tactics for it and also future variants. But before we have a look at those, let's have a closer look at the Gelgoog itself. First up, the head was essentially a miniaturized version of the Zaku 2 F-Type's head. Thanks to advances in technology, the power pipes were now more integrated into the design and could now be placed inside of the armor. One of the measures taken on the Gelgoog that showed that it was made with anti-mobile suit combat in mind, especially close combat. Another big improvement were its sensors. Prior to the Gelgoog, high-performance sensors and specialized computer systems were expensive and therefore only meant for commander-type units. With the Gelgoog then, the cost of these systems had gone down, leading to a high-performance sensor array becoming standard equipment on the Gelgoog's head. This array incorporated hybrid sensors as well as an antenna, giving every Gelgoog the same capabilities as a commander-type machine. And these communication capabilities could then be further improved upon by installing a commander antenna. Just throw in today's sponsor NordVPN and it's perfect. Not only will they increase your online security, but they'll also help you dodge those pesky region locks, which is why I use NordVPN on a daily basis. And by using the link down below, or using the code kkrt, you'll not just get a sweet discount, but you'll also be directly supporting the channel. Next up, the arms. These would come with some very interesting features, like thermonuclear jet engines mounted on the forearms. These were mainly designed with the prospect of having the Gelgoog fighting on Earth, which, unfortunately for the designers, is something that only happened to a very minimal degree. At least they would also prove to be useful when maneuvering in low-gravity locations, like, for example, in colonies. In space, though, these would essentially be dead weight, so it's a good thing that they were also made to be modular and could be easily switched out with extra offensive or extra defensive equipment. One of these was a beam spot gun for extra close range defense. But while it would become standard equipment on later Gelgoog variants, I don't know about any standard Gelgoogs ever using these, but apparently they could. And this then also brings us to the next thing about the arms. In terms of size, they're still relatively the same as the Zaku 2 F-Type, but in terms of performance, they're worlds apart. Despite still using the same kind of drive system, it got miniaturized, resulting in much faster movements becoming possible. And this of course was not limited to just the arms. It also went for the hands, the legs, etc. So overall, the Gelgoog had much higher agility. The reason then that the hands and the arms specifically were still relatively the same size as the F-Type was because new parts had to be implemented to transmit the energy for the beam weapons. Also, while it's not always shown in every rendition of the Gelgoog, it's generally agreed upon that it does have sub-thrusters in the shoulder armor, which then also immediately explain why they're the shape they are and why they're so big and bulky. The body then is where we find the biggest difference with the Zaku. Rather than being based on the Zaku, the body adopted a segmented structure that was based on that of the Federation's RX prototypes, including a cockpit block for increased pilot survivability. Another big change then was of course the generator, which now needed to be beam weapon capable. And for this, they looked at two different mobile suits. On the one hand, they looked at amphibious mobile suits, which were already effectively using megaparticle cannons, and on the other hand, they looked at the Zaku 2 High Mobility Type R2, a mobile suit that was at one point in time planned to use beam weapons. And what also needed to be included was a new cooling system. Perhaps out of redundancy, or perhaps out of necessity, we see a lot more cooling vents on the Gelgoog's body than on pretty much any other mobile suit of the time. And finally, we've got the legs. Just like the high mobility type Zaku's, the legs of the Gelgoog would first and foremost serve as glorified mobile thrusters. So the initial plan was to give the Gelgoog a development of the legs seen on the Zaku 2 High Mobility Type R2, perhaps even the exact same ones that we saw on the R3. But to give the Gelgoog even better mobility, Zimmat was brought in to apply Rigdom style thrusters to both the Gelgoog's legs and the back skirt. These would first be tested out on a cream-colored prototype at Granada, and potentially it would be this prototype that was used in trials against the Gyan. Trials where the Gelgoog completely outperformed the Gyan. And now, let's have a look at its standard weapons. A beam rifle, a beam naginata, and the shield. Or perhaps I should say, its planned standard weapons, because like I said earlier on in the video, when the first Gelgoog pre-production types were rolled off the production line, the beam rifle wasn't anywhere to be seen yet. It ended up becoming a joint project between the Albert Company and MIP, and it also incorporated technology that Zeon was able to obtain from the Federation. One theory suggests that Special Forces were able to acquire this tech by infiltrating Site 7, while another theory suggests that Zeon was able to scavenge Federation beam rifles that were found on the battlefield, which they were then able to successfully reverse engineer. Whatever the case might be, perhaps even both cases, this resulted in a prototype beam rifle that was used by the MS-06R3S, which then most likely got further developed into the beam rifle used by the Gelgoog. But all of this took time. The YMS-14 Gelgoog pre-production type was rolled out in late October, but the beam rifle wasn't ready for production until some point in November. In total, it is said that the requirement for beam weapons delayed the Gelgoog by at least 2 to 3 months. The end result, though, was a beam rifle rivaling that of the RX-78-2, with a high-performance sensor on the top. And according to some sources, it also came with some extra attachments. Here you can see the beam rifle with a bipod and an underslung grenade launcher. Something that varies from source to source then is how many fingers are on the trigger. The original setting is that the beam rifle was designed to have 2 fingers on the trigger. But a lot of materials, even contemporary works, straight up ignore this setting and show the Gelgoog with a more traditional single finger on the trigger, without even the space to have that second finger there. And it wouldn't be just the beam rifle where we have some inconsistencies. The beam naginata also has some. Sometimes listed as a beam naginata, sometimes listed as a double beam sword, this close combat weapon was made by the Albert Corporation. And unlike most other beam sabers of the time, it came equipped with a dual beam emitter, allowing the pilot to choose between either activating both beams or just a single beam. Activating both beams at once might be the more iconic choice, but it was also the more difficult choice, so in practice, pilots would often choose to activate only one of the blades, something even legendary ace pilot Char is seen doing. The inconsistency then is the color of this blade. In the original Gundam anime, it was blue, but then in the compilation movies, it was yellow. So in the following years, you'll see both colors popping up in different places, although nowadays, you'll see almost exclusively yellow. Almost. Another thing that can be a bit inconsistent is the shape of the beam. Usually it's curved, but sometimes it's straight like a standard beam saber. And because of this, certain model kits actually give you both options so you can choose. And when non-use, the beam naginata can be stored in 3 places. Usually it's stored on the back, but if an optional backpack is equipped, it can also be stored inside of the shield or on the back skirt. And we'll talk more about these optional backpacks in a second. First, we're rounding up the Gelgoog's standard equipment with its very distinct shield, which is shaped like a Nguni shield. Like most shields in Gundam though, it's really nothing more than a heavy slab of metal treated with an anti-beam coating, so it was effective at both blocking physical and beam attacks. And when non-use, it could be stored on the back. Its large size though was not always seen as a benefit. It was heavy and had an impact on the Gelgoog's mobility, so because of this, certain ace pilots would opt not to use the shield, and smaller shields were also eventually developed. For optional equipment then, we have to look at the Gelgoog's back. In its standard configuration, it didn't have a backpack, which is quite a rare sight for a mobile suit. But this can be solved very quickly. Instead of having a fixed backpack, the Gelgoog was designed to be able to quickly change its backpack depending on the situation. And even when the pre-production Gelgoogs were first rolled out, or at the very least, very shortly after they were rolled out, 2 different backpacks were already available. A high mobility backpack, turning the Gelgoog into the B-type, and a cannon backpack, turning the Gelgoog into the C-type. Of these 2 backpacks, the high mobility backpack is the most straightforward. It's the standard Gelgoog with a high-speed booster backpack, resulting in the MS-14B Gelgoog high mobility type. Still, despite being such a simple conversion, the backpack did have a very big effect on performance. Its design was based on the Zaku high mobility type's backpack with a propellant tank on the top and its main thrusters on the bottom. But what set it apart was how its mobility was achieved. The Zakus used flaps to direct the thrust, but the Gelgoogs had sub-thrusters installed on the side of the backpack. Another cool feature was that weapons could be mounted on the side, allowing the Gelgoog high mobility type to carry a variety of weapons into battle. So with just the addition of a simple backpack, the Gelgoog got better mobility, higher speed, and more weapons. As a result, these high mobility type Gelgoogs were perfect for hit and run tactics, and one of its most famous pilots would be Johnny Raiden. It's said that he was the first recipient of the B-type, and there are some different versions of his B-type floating around. In the original MSV books, we find these 2 Gelgoogs, one without a commander antenna, painted in a red and black color scheme, and then one with a commander antenna, painted in a mostly red color scheme. According to the description, the red and black version was from when Johnny was still test flying the Gelgoog. But then, when it was ready for combat, it was given a commander antenna and repainted red. Modern depictions of his Gelgoog, though, almost always go for the iconic red and black color scheme. Sometimes without the commander antenna, sometimes with the commander antenna. And sometimes this commander antenna is the standard one, and sometimes it's the bigger one. The MSV Ace Pilot Log book then turns this inconsistency into lore. Here, they say that Johnny's Gelgoog initially did not have a commander antenna, just like in the original MSV setting, but then that it would be equipped with different kinds of antennas for testing purposes. The cannon backpack then can trace its roots back to the troubles that arose with the development of the beam rifle. After experiencing issues with the miniaturization, the cannon backpack was made as a plan B. The idea was simple: if the handheld beam rifle couldn't be completed, then they would at least have a backpack mounted beam cannon ready. It is believed that the cannon backpack was based on the high mobility backpack with an RA2 beam cannon mounted on the right side and a radiator for cooling on the left side. The beam cannon was made by MIP and was modified from a beam cannon used on an unspecified mobile armor, which was of course MIP's specialty. This backpack could be used as is, as we can see in this image of Johnny Ryden's main Gelgoog using it, but it was actually designed to work with a dedicated head. The shape was quite different because it featured an extra sensor designed to work with the beam cannon. This sensor would automate some of the cannon's functions, lessening the burden on the pilot. This then allowed him to focus more on piloting the Gelgoog, or on more easily using multiple weapons at once, which was of course something that the so-called Gelgoog cannon was designed for. On its arms, it could use either the standard issue jet engines, or it could go for a buckler shield and a 3-tube missile launcher. And it wasn't just the cannon backpack that was rushed through development because the beam rifle wasn't ready yet. The giant bazooka was a very powerful and also a very popular weapon, and in fact, we do see the Gelgoog using it. But at the same time, it was a large and cumbersome weapon, so there was a definite need for a weapon that offered heavy firepower in a relatively small package. This then led to the Chimera Corps rapidly developing the 360mm Bullpup rocket launcher, a weapon that would be used by both the Gelgoog high mobility type and the Gelgoog cannon. And what the Gelgoog cannon could of course also be outfitted with was a commander antenna, although it is a pretty rare sight. This version of the Gelgoog would be famously used by aces like Thomas Kurtz, Brennus Ox, and Johnny Ryden. Now, since we see Johnny using both the Gelgoog high mobility type and the Gelgoog cannon, you might be thinking that this was the same Gelgoog, just configured differently for different missions. And this certainly was a possibility. Changing between the different types was pretty easy, and earlier on in the video I even showed this image of Johnny's standard Gelgoog using just the cannon backpack. And we even see this Gelgoog completely outfitted with cannon parts. But he's also known to be using this Gelgoog cannon. Not only does it have a different color scheme, but it also has a different registration number. His most famous Gelgoog is the O10, usually outfitted with a high mobility backpack, and his second Gelgoog is the O11, usually configured as a Gelgoog cannon. Why did Johnny have two Gelgoogs? Well, the most common explanation is that this allowed him to sortie even if one of his Gelgoogs was being serviced.
Johnny Ryden here. I'm taking off.
And just like the Federation's Gundam, the pre-production type Gelgoogs managed to impress, especially the 24 units assigned to the newly formed Chimera Corps. Slowly but surely, the Gelgoog was getting ready for mass production, and the pre-production prototype Gelgoogs were now reclassified. The Y from the model number was dropped because that was Zeon's designation for a prototype unit, and an S was added to mark it as a commander unit. So it went from the YMS-14 pre-production type Gelgoog to the MS-14S Gelgoog commander type. But that's not all. As you'll remember, the 24 YMS-14s assigned to the Chimera Corps were all modified into either Gelgoog high mobility types or Gelgoog cannons. So, while the Gelgoog was still classified as a pre-production unit, the high mobility types got the model number YMS-14B and the cannon types YMS-14C. When the reclassification then happened, these got their now standard model numbers, being MS-14B and MS-14C respectively. So when you really think about it, the only pre-production type Gelgoog that saw any combat as an MS-14S was Char's Gelgoog. The others were all modified, and no more MS-14Ss were made. After this, every Gelgoog made was an MS-14A mass production type Gelgoog, which could then be modified by attaching a commander antenna or one of the two backpacks. Bandai even went as far as to retcon one of the other MS-14Ss that you might know about. In the intro scene for 0083, Honorable Gato pilots a personalized Gelgoog, and despite not having a commander antenna, in the early days, this thing was often referred to as an MS-14S Gelgoog commander type. But soon after this, Bandai kinda clamped down on the lore and began to exclusively list this thing as an MS-14A. Again, the only MS-14Ss were the 25 units that were reclassified pre-production types. Anything else, whether it has a commander antenna or not, is just an A-type. Those A-types and their variants, though, are a video for next time. So for now, let's wrap up by tackling 3 final variants of the YMS-14 Gelgoog / MS-14S Gelgoog. For the first one, we have to return to the unit Char received. His stint in the Gelgoog would unfortunately not be quite as successful. Depending on the media, he would use it against Amuro and the Gundam 2 or 3 times, and despite having the advantage, he wouldn't be able to defeat Amuro a single time. The first time, he was barely able to fight a damaged Gundam to a standstill, the second time he was forced to retreat after losing an arm, and then after this arm was fixed, he would face Amuro for the third time. This resulted in Char's Gelgoog losing an arm again, as well as his most important ally, Lala Soon and the Elmeth. Fast forward to the Battle of Abawa-Ku. Here, Char would famously use the Zeong, but it would be destroyed near the end of the battle. This then left Char without a mobile suit, but fortunately for him, the Gelgoog had been repaired. The lost arm was replaced with one from a Gelgoog Marine type, a variant we'll cover in a future video, and it got a B-type high mobility type backpack. So not only did it get repaired, it got upgraded. He would then use this machine to cover the many Zeon soldiers fleeing to Axis, where one day they hoped to get their revenge. Once here, Char's Gelgoog would receive one more round of upgrades, turning it into the MS-14U Gelgoog Outer Space type. It got a complete overhaul with a focus on space combat, the high mobility type backpack got removed, and it also got some new weapons. It got a single Vulcan gun on the left side of its head, a 110mm machine cannon on the right arm, and a beam saber stored in the left arm. For handheld weaponry then, it would initially use the same weapons as the standard Gelgoog, like a beam rifle and a shield, but later on, it would also get a prototype large beam rifle. This weapon was much more powerful than the Gelgoog's standard beam rifle, and it even came with its own built-in generator, allowing even Zakus to use it. The downside though was that it could only fire 5 times. What's interesting about the mobile suit itself then is that it looks very different from the standard Gelgoog. But in the December 2010 issue of Gundam Ace, the real-life designer of this version said that this was only done to make it interesting for the manga that it appeared in, and in actuality, the design would be much closer to that of the original Gelgoog. The next two variants then are completely non-canonical variants. A unit that you might have seen is the Ramba custom pre-production type Gelgoog. In the normal timeline, this is of course totally impossible, with Ramba having died in combat well before he could have gotten this machine. But in the Giran's Greed video games, you get to make decisions that change pivotal events from the series. And one of these changes you can make is preventing Ramba from dying by giving him the DOMs that he should have gotten. In this new timeline then, he eventually gets one of the pre-production type Gelgoogs painted in his custom blue color scheme. However, remember what I said about Gato's Gelgoog being retconned? Well, in Giran's Greed, his unit is also listed as a pre-production type Gelgoog. So if Gato's Gelgoog is now an MS-14A, then you might also want to consider Rambaral's Gelgoog an MS-14A. Just one with a commander antenna. And finally then, we have this custom red Gelgoog from the Gundam Combat card game. It's got a lot more verniers, a high-powered backpack reminiscent of the Gelgoog Marine Commander type, and a more beefy-looking beam rifle. One funny thing is that its flavor text kinda reminds me of the Gundam saying from Gundam Wing. Those who have laid eyes on this red Gelgoog shall be instantly turned into stardust. And that was how the first actual Gelgoogs came to be. It was a long, difficult process with a lot of hurdles along the way, but Zeon finally did it. Now, all that was left to do was to mass produce them. So join me next time as we look at what happened with the mass production Gelgoogs. Don't forget to check out NordVPN with the link down below, or the code kkrt. As always, a big thank you to the Patreon supporters. I hope everyone watching has a great day, and I'll see you all next time.